Resident Evil started with not only an evil resident, but also an evil residence. And not just any, with the evil residence. Obviously, I'm talking about the iconic Spencer Mansion. It was so well designed that it was arguably why the first Resident Evil and subsequently the whole survival horror genre blew up, and it still holds up today as one of the best survival horror game locations. And it's just as fun to explore now as almost 30 years ago. At least I assume so, because the little happy accident that I was still far from being born. Anyway, the best part is that it's present in more than just one game to bring even more fun to the table. And in this video we want to find out which iteration of the Spencer Mansion is the best. So how does the original mansion, the remake of the original mansion, the copy of the original mansion and the second copy of the original mansion stack up against each other? The original Spencer Mansion from Resident Evil 1 started it all in 1996. If there wasn't a certain other game after this one, I would say that it's by far the most iconic and well-known one. I mean, most survival horror fans have probably seen it at least once, even if it's just for the Jill Sandwich line. But apart from that, it's also just very good, even if you look at it completely isolated without acknowledging the other Resident Evil games and what it started. It has a wonderful learning curve and introduces the player wonderfully to the survival horror genre and opens up gradually. Especially because the game literally tells you to go through the big blue door at the other side of the hall, before opening up even more and trusting the player more and more. Even today it still has one of the best beginnings for survival horror games. Because of this, I also recommend everyone to play the first Resident Evil if you have troubles getting used to the exploration in these games. But apart from that, the exploration is highly enjoyable in general, as it manages to strike a very good balance between being challenging and not too linear, but also not too tedious and complicated. Honestly, when I think about it, there's barely any other game that manages to be this good in this regard, even if I look at other Resident Evil and great survival horror games, because pretty much every other game is either more tedious or too easy and straightforward. Additionally, the puzzles are fun as well, although slightly outdated sometimes. Especially the armor room puzzle, which is barely a puzzle, feels just stupid today, but otherwise I love most of them. The piano puzzle with the iconic Moonlight Sonata is obviously one of the standout puzzles of the game, simply because of how cool it is, even though it's barely a puzzle. But I also really like the idea of most other ones like the gallery and different jewel puzzles. Also small shout out to the added puzzles in the rebirth mode of the DS version, Resident Evil Deadly Silence, that are even cooler, and I recommend every RE1 fan to play that mode at least once. Anyway, the amount of enemies is also good and it never feels like too much is thrown at you while still being challenging. A lot of them also manage to scare the player if you don't expect them, like the iconic window jump scare or some funny that decide to stand behind corners. My biggest criticisms of it are probably the colors and the fact that half of the mansion is basically in broad daylight, because someone apparently decided to use floodlights as lamps, and all I can say is that I wouldn't want to pay that electricity bill. For some reasons other areas look perfect and very eerie though, so I'm not sure if it's done on purpose, which wouldn't make much sense because they changed it in a remake, but I'm not a fan of it anyway. Especially because it loses a lot of the horror factor because of this. I can't deny that it helps for some variety though, because pretty much every hallway and room looks fairly unique. Last but not least, I want to mention the soundtrack, which is good and fairly eerie for the most parts. I mean, there are some oopsies like the director's cut basement music, but most of it is solid and helps the atmosphere. I also like to use it in my videos occasionally, so it can't be that bad, right? More interestingly is probably how prominent it is, considering that there's fairly loud background music in most rooms that is constantly playing. Overall, it is arguably one of the reasons the game was so successful, and one could have barely wished for a better start. It's not perfect, but still very enjoyable to this day in pretty much every regard, and great for getting used to survival horror games. You know what's also great? That you are watching this video right now. So please consider subscribing if you are enjoying it, especially because a lot of you haven't yet, even though you watch my videos. Thank you! The next iteration of the Spencer Mansion is arguably the most iconic one and just fantastic. And of course I'm talking about the remake version. It expands on the original mansion without cutting anything. No areas are cut, instead it added new ones that fit into the game seamlessly. It's actually so perfectly done that I sometimes forget that certain areas are missing from the original when playing it, because I'm so used to the changes. Puzzles also remain pretty much the same or are improved, like the armor room puzzle. Apart from that, there are also plenty of new ones that are all very cool as well, like the dog whistle. Unsurprisingly, these changes make exploration even more fun, because the mansion is a bit bigger and there's just a bit more to uncover. especially because they moved or changed certain encounters, like the dog jump scare that only occurs now if you run down the hallway from the other side, so even players who come from the original can still be surprised. The Crimson Heads also make for a nice challenge, although many people dislike them for being annoying and unnecessary, but I personally like them. Unfortunately, Capcom really messed up the learning curve. While the original gets more and more difficult as you progress, the remake version is basically the hardest at the very beginning. Instead of just having to go through the big door, you have to get the golden arrow for the arrowhead first, which you find on the added area on the second floor, then you have to go to the graveyard to go down a weird tunnel, where you find a book with the armor key, and then you can go through the big door. This whole progress is just incredibly confusing and very hard for a first time player, because it's fairly unclear where to go and you encounter plenty of enemies with very little ammo on the way. After that, the game gets a much better flow though and is much more fun and really improves on the original. Apart from that, the tone of the game has changed and in my opinion much better. Instead of bright and colorful corridors, there are now dark hallways with lightning strikes flashing through the windows, dim lights and old looking furniture. In general, everything looks a lot more realistic and feels more like a spooky place now instead of whatever the hell the original was. Although this also led to most places looking fairly similar, instead of having almost every hallway looking at least slightly different. They also turned down the music a bit and changed some tracks, making it a lot more atmospheric and supporting for the very eerie and quiet ambience now. Overall, the remake version of the Spencer Mansion is great and one of the finest pieces of survival horror gaming. Without the annoying beginning, I would probably go even as far as to say that it's perfect. But it still has a fantastic horror atmosphere, great puzzles and exploration, and is miles more immersive than the original. In my opinion, it also gets more fun with every playthrough because you master it more and more, which is even more satisfying than in the original because it's a bit harder and longer. And you don't have to deal with the bad beginning anymore because you already know how to handle it. Fair enough, the next iteration is technically not really the Spencer Mansion, but I still wanted to include it. Be ready for Code Veronica's weird copy of the main hall and some more. Yeah, this section is probably going to be a lot shorter. Obviously, it's barely comparable to the IE1 mansions, simply because it's just a main hall and art room. There's also the small corridor on the second floor, but that's just a bit inspired by it and not directly copied. I still appreciate it a lot though, because it's a very cool throwback to the original Spencer Mansion and really surprised me on my first playthrough. Apart from that, I really like the idea of the secret door behind the painting, which was even recycled for the IE1 remake 2 years later. And the statue puzzle that is very similar to the original one from IE1, but with the added mechanic of having to turn off the electricity later to retrieve the jewels. Call it cheesy, but I also love the concept of having Chris and Wesker meet there before the first boss fight against Alexia, considering that they both parted ways after the original Spencer Mansion. All in all, it's pretty short, but still one of the most memorable places of Code Veronica, and I really like the idea of having the short return. Although I have to admit that I would have liked it to be a bit longer, because it's just pretty damn cool. Resident Evil 5's Lost in Nightmares DLC returns to the kinda Spencer Mansion again, just like Code Veronica before, and it's just as cool again. It's actually my favorite part of Resident Evil 5, which is a bit weird to say considering that it's just a DLC. And opposite to Code Veronica, it covers more than 2 rooms though, but still not the whole mansion. We get the main hall, a few hallways, some rooms, and an underground area, which is completely new and not inspired by the original mansion in any way, but hey, I take it. Apart from that, there are plenty of references and it actually feels a lot more like a survival horror game than the base game. There are door transitions when going through a door, some puzzles, items taken from the first few games like the crank, the piano returns and even more. They even included an optional fixed camera angle mode for the first part of the DLC. Apart from that, there are also just a few very strong enemies which fit the location and more horror oriented feel better than having to fight a whole army like in the main game and most games in general since Resident Evil 4. It's also a cool concept again to have a lot of lore here regarding Umbrella, Wesker and even the ash rods from Code Veronica, and showing how Jill ended up being mind controlled by Wesker. I mean, it could have been any location, but it just feels a bit cooler here. In the end, Resident Evil 5's Spencer Mansion is arguably the one that changes the most, but arguably also a cooler throwback than the bit in Code Veronica. Especially if you consider the rest of the game that is almost as far away as you can get from the early Resident Evils, because they made sure to really adapt the gameplay to the feel of the mansion and early games. So what would you say is the best Spencer Mansion? Mine is probably the one from the Resident Evil remake, simply because I love the atmosphere and layout of it. But I really like every iteration of it and approve every time that it's a great location for horror games. And now I'm going to wonder if I have to update this video in case we get a new Resident Evil 1 remake. So thanks a lot for watching, please subscribe, like and share the video if you enjoyed it, and see you next time.